Organization of the respiratory system. The main function of respiration are to provide oxygen to the tissues and remove carbon dioxide. As most tissues in the body survive on oxygen to produce energy, there is a requirement for a continuous supply of oxygen and removal of carbon dioxide. The four major components of respiration are as follows. Pulmonary ventilation, which means the inflow and outflow of air between the atmosphere and the lung alveoli. Diffusion of oxygen and carbon dioxide between the alveoli and the blood. Transport of oxygen and carbon dioxide in the blood and body fluids and to form the body's tissue cells. Then regulation of ventilation and other facets of respiration. The respiratory system also performs several non-respiratory functions which are described later. So the respiratory system in humans has evolved to include the following structures. Lungs, the conducting airways including the oral and nasal cavities, and the nerves that control respiration and the respiratory centers in the central nervous system. Then the structures involved in moving air in and out of the lungs, such as rib cage, intercostal muscles, diaphragm, abdominal muscles. Anatomical organization of the lungs and airways. The lungs are the organs for respiration and are two in number, the left and right lung. Each lung is further divided into lobes. Lungs into lobes. The right lung is divided into three lobes. Right lung into three lobes. Right lung is divided into three lobes, upper, middle, and lower lobes. Upper, middle, and lower lobes. And the left lung is divided into two lobes, upper and lower lobes. The lungs are covered by thin membranous layers called pleura. The visceral pleura lines the lungs and are separated from the parietal pleura by a pleural sac or cavity, which is filled by pleural fluid. This interface helps the lungs to glide smoothly during inspiration and expiration. The trachea, bronchi, bronchioles, and respiratory unit. The air is distributed to the lungs in way of trachea, bronchi, and bronchioles. The trachea branches out into two main bronchi, which branch further into lobar bronchi that connect each lobe. This lobar bronchi further branch out into segmental bronchi and into smaller branches until they reach the terminal bronchioles, which are the smallest airways without any alveoli attached. All these airways do not participate in any gas exchange and are referred to as conducting zone. The terminal bronchioles are further divided into respiratory bronchioles. These bronchioles differ from the terminal bronchioles because they have alveoli occasionally attached to their walls. The respiratory bronchioles lead to the alveolar duct and finally to the alveoli. Next, alveolar duct, then alveoli. This region where alveoli are present in the lungs and where gas exchange takes place is called respiratory zone. Then respiratory unit, also called a respiratory lobule. Respiratory lobule. Respiratory lobule, which is composed of a respiratory bronchiole, alveolar ducts, and alveoli. There are about 300 million alveoli in the two lungs, and each alveolus has an average diameter of about 0.2 mm. The alveolar walls are extremely thin, and between the alveoli is an almost solid network of interconnecting capillaries. Indeed, because of the extensiveness of the capillary plexus, the flow of blood in the alveolar wall has been described as sheet of flowing blood. Thus, it is obvious that the alveolar gases are in a very close proximity to the blood. Gas exchange between the alveolar air and the pulmonary blood occurs through the membranes of all the terminal portions of the lungs, not merely in the alveoli. All these membranes are collectively known as the respiratory membrane, so-called pulmonary membrane, which is described later. So, respiratory membrane is an important structure that shows the ultrastructure of the respiratory membrane drawn in cross section on the left and red blood cell on the right. It also shows the diffusion of O2 from the alveolus into the red blood cell and diffusion of CO2 in the opposite direction. Then all these membranes are collectively known as the respiratory membrane. Respiratory membrane, also called the pulmonary membrane, which is described later. So respiratory membrane or pulmonary membrane shows the ultrastructure of the respiratory membrane drawn in cross section of the left and right blood cell on the right. So some portions are there: superior lobus, middle lobe, inferior lobe, hilum of tracheae, cardiac notch. These are the anatomical portions. And the pleural membrane covering of the lung, visceral pleura and parietal pleura. These two portions are there: visceral pleura and parietal pleura. Despite the large number of layers, the overall thickness of the respiratory membrane in some areas is as little as 0.2 μm and average about 0.6 μm, except that there are cell nuclei. From histological studies, it has been estimated that the total surface area of respiratory membrane is about 70 cm square in the healthy adult human male, which is equivalent to the floor area of a 25 into 30 feet room. The total quantity of blood in the capillaries of the lungs at any given instance is 60 to 140 ml. Now, imagine the small amount of blood spread over the entire surface of a 25 into 30 feet floor, and it is easy to understand the rapidity of respiratory exchange of O2 and CO2. The average diameter of the pulmonary capillaries is only about 5 μm, which means that red blood cells must squeeze through them. The red blood cell membrane usually touches the capillary wall, so O2 and CO2 need not pass through the significant amounts of plasma as they diffuse between the alveolus and red blood cell. This too increase the rapidity of diffusion. Then physical laws applicable in respiratory physiology. For a student to understand the various concepts in respiratory physiology, it is important to understand the various physical gas laws and their applicability to respiratory physiology. Boyle's law, Charles' law, and ideal gas law. We know these laws. Then Avogadro's law, Dalton's law, Henry's law, Graham's law. Henry's law states that at constant temperature, the amount of gas dissolved in a liquid will be directly proportional to the partial pressure of gas with which the liquid is in equilibrium. That is that at constant temperature, the amount of gas dissolved in liquid will be directly proportional to the partial pressure of the gas in which the liquid is in equilibrium. Then Graham's law. In a gas phase, Graham's law states that the rate of diffusion of a gas is inversely proportional to its molecular weight. And Fick's law. Next topic, non-respiratory functions of the lungs. Although the lungs function primarily for respiration, they also perform several other functions also. If you try to learn a portion of this respiratory passage, you could see portions like concha, pharynx, glottis, epiglottis, larynx, vocal cords, esophagus, trachea, pulmonary arteries and pulmonary veins and alveoli, pulmonary capillary and pulmonary vein. So non-respiratory functions of the lungs. Although the lungs function primarily for respiration, they also perform several other functions that are not directly related to respiration. Filtration function. The hairs at the entrance to the nostrils are important for filtering out large particles. Much more important, though, is the removal of particles by turbulent precipitation. That is, the air passing through the nasal passage hits many obstructing veins, the conchae, also called turbinates, because they cause turbulence of the air. The septum and the pharyngeal wall. Each time air hits one of these obstructions, it must change its direction of movement. The particles suspended in the air, having far more mass and momentum than air, cannot change their direction of travel as rapidly as the air can. Therefore, they continue forward, striking the surfaces of the obstructions and are entrapped in the mucous coating and transported by the cilia to the pharynx to be swallowed. Size of particles entrapped in the respiratory passage. The nasal turbulence mechanism for removing particles from air is so effective that almost no particle larger than 6 μm in diameter enter the lungs through the nose. The size is smaller than the size of a red blood cell. Of the remaining particles, many that are between 1 and 5 μm settle in the smaller bronchioles as a result of gravitational precipitation. For instance, terminal bronchioles disease is common in coal miners because of settled dust particles. Some of the still smaller particles diffuse against the walls of the alveoli and adhere to the alveolar fluid. However, many particles smaller than 0.5 in diameter remain suspended in the alveolar air and expelled by the expiration. For instance, the particles of cigarette smoke are about 0.3 μm. Almost none of these particles are precipitated in the respiratory passageways before they reach the alveoli. Unfortunately, up to one-third of them do participate in the alveoli by the diffusion process, with the balance remaining suspended and expelled in the expired air. Name of branches: trachea, bronchi, bronchioles, terminal bronchioles, respiratory bronchioles, alveolar ducts, alveolar sacs. Terminal bronchioles, smooth muscles are there. Respiratory bronchiole, elastic fibers, alveolar duct, alveolar sacs, respiratory unit. Immune function. Another route by which invading organisms frequently enter the body is through the lungs. Large number of tissue macrophages are present in integral components of the alveolar walls. They can phagocytize particles that become entrapped in the alveoli. Many of the particles that become entrapped in the alveoli are removed by alveolar macrophages. And others are carried away by the lung lymphatics. If the particles are digestible, the macrophages can also digest them and release the digestive products into the lymph. If the particle is not digestible, the macrophages often form a giant cell capsule around the particle until such time, if ever, that it can be slowly dissolved. Such capsules are frequently formed around tuberculosis bacilli, silica dust particles, and even carbon dioxide particles. An excess of particles can cause growth of fibrous tissue in the alveolar septa, leading to permanent debility. Then metabolic functions. The cells of the lungs, especially the endothelial cells of the capillary bed that line the alveoli, have developed the capability to metabolize various metabolic and vasoactive substances. Some of the substances include protein, lipid, cytokines, and vasoactive amines. Other notable examples are as follows. Angiotensin 1 is activated to angiotensin 2. Angiotensin 1 is activated to angiotensin 2 by angiotensin converting enzyme present at the surface of the endothelial cells. Serotonin is metabolized by the endothelial cells after being internalized into the cell. Some of the substances that are synthesized and secreted by the endothelial cells include cytokines, prostaglandins, prostacyclin, nitric oxide, and clotting factor. Then vocalization and phonation. Speech involves not only the respiratory system, also specific speech nerves control centers in the cerebral cortex, respiratory control centers of the brain, and the articulation and resonance structure of the mouth and nasal cavities. Speech is composed of two mechanical functions: phonation, which is achieved by the larynx, and articulation, which is achieved by the structure of the mouth. Then we try to learn about the ultrastructure of the alveolar respiratory membrane. We could see portions like alveolar epithelium, endothelial basement membrane, fluid and surfactant layer. Fluid and surfactant layer first. Then second, alveolar epithelium. Then epithelial basement membrane and capillary alveoli. O2 diffuse into the capillary from alveoli. CO2 diffuse into the alveolus from capillary. Red blood cell, interstitial space, capillary basement membrane, capillary endothelium. Then phonation. The larynx is especially adapted to act as a vibrator. The vibrating membranes are the vocal folds, commonly called the vocal cords. Vocal cords, they are seen in looking into glottis with a laryngoscope. During phonation, the cords move together so that passage of air between them can cause vibration, articulation, and resonance. Different layers of the respiratory membrane. A layer of fluid containing surfactant that lines the alveolus and reduces the surface tension of the alveolar fluid. The alveolar epithelium, which is composed of thin epithelial cells and epithelial basement membrane. A thin interstitial space between the alveolar epithelium and the capillary membrane. A capillary basement membrane that in many places fuses with the alveolar epithelial basement membrane. The capillary endothelial membrane. Some other functions like acid-base balance is also taking place. The non-respiratory functions of lung in glands, filtration function, immune function, metabolic function, phonation, acid-base balance. Okay. Mechanics of breathing. Mechanics of pulmonary ventilation. Muscles that cause lung expansion and contraction. The lungs can be expanded and contracted in two ways, by downward and upward movement of the diaphragm to lengthen or shorten the chest cavity. Muscles that cause the lung expansion and contraction. The lungs can be expanded and contracted in two ways, by downward and upward movement of the diaphragm to lengthen or shorten the chest cavity. By downward and upward movement of the diaphragm to lengthen or shorten the chest cavity. By elevation and depression of the ribs to increase and decrease the anteroposterior diameter of the chest cavity using the intercostal muscles. The mechanics of breathing. Mechanics of pulmonary ventilation. Muscles that cause lung expansion and contraction. The lungs can be expanded and contracted in two ways, by downward and upward movement of the diaphragm to lengthen or shorten the chest cavity, by elevation and depression of the ribs to increase and decrease the anterior-posterior diameter of the chest cavity using the intercostal muscles. Normal, quiet breathing is accomplished almost entirely by the first method, that is, by movement of the diaphragm. During inspiration, contraction of the diaphragm pulls the lower surface of the lungs downward. Then during expiration, the diaphragm simply relaxes and the elastic recoil of the lungs, chest wall and the abdominal structures compresses the lungs and expels the air. Then during heavy breathing, however, the elastic forces are not powerful enough to cause necessary rapid expiration. So extra force is achieved mainly by contraction of the abdominal muscles, which pushes the abdominal contents upward against the bottom of the diaphragm, thereby compressing the lungs. The second method for expanding the lungs is to raise the rib cage. Raising the rib cage expands the lungs because in the natural resting position, the ribs slant downward, allowing the sternum to fall backward towards the vertebral column. When the rib cage is elevated, however, the ribs project almost directly forward, so the sternum also moves forward away from the spine, making the anterior-posterior thickness of the chest about 20% greater during maximum inspiration than during expiration. Therefore, all the muscles that elevate the chest cage are classified as muscles of inspiration, and the muscles that depress the chest cage are classified as muscles of expiration. Muscles that depress the chest cage are classified as muscles of expiration. The most important muscles that raise the rib cage are the external intercostals, but others that help are the sternocleidomastoid muscles, which lift upward in the sternum. Which are they? Intercostal muscles, external intercostals, not internal, external intercostals, sternocleidomastoid muscles, then anterior serrati muscles, which lift many of the ribs, and scalene, scalene, which lift the first two ribs, and alae nasi, which cause flaring of the nostrils. The muscles that pull the rib cage downward during expiration are mainly the abdominal recti, which have the powerful effect of pulling downward on the lower ribs at the same time that these and other abdominal muscles also compress the abdominal contents upward against the diaphragm, the internal intercostals. The mechanism by which the external and internal intercostals act to cause inspiration and expiration. To the left, the ribs during expiration are angled downward, and the external intercostals are elongated forward and downward. As they contract, they pull the upper ribs forward in relation to the lower rib, which cause leverage of the ribs to raise them upward, thereby causing inspiration. The internal intercostals function exactly in the opposite manner, functioning as expiratory muscles because they angle between the ribs in the opposite direction and cause opposite leverage. The actions of the intercostal muscles are shown, so summary of the events are explained later. So pressure that causes the movement of air in and out of the lungs. To keep it inflated, also there are no attachment between the lung and the walls of the chest cage except that it is suspended at its hilum from the mediastinum, the middle section of the chest cavity. Mediastinum. Instead, the lung floats on the thoracic cavity surrounded by a thin layer of pleural fluid that lubricates movement of the lungs within the cavity. Further, continued suction to express excess fluid into lymphatic channels maintain a slight suction between the visceral surface of the lung pleura and the parietal pleura surface of the thoracic cavity. Therefore, the lungs are held to the thoracic wall as if glued there, except that they are well lubricated and can slide freely as the chest expands and contracts. Then pleural pressure and its changes during respiration. Once again, this increased vertical diameter, increased AP diameter, external intercostals contracted, internal intercostals relaxed, elevated rib cage, diaphragmatic contraction in expiration and inspiration, sternum, etc. Pleural pressure and its changes during respiration. Pleural pressure is the pressure of the fluid in the thin space between the lung pleura and the chest wall pleura. As noted earlier, this pressure is normally a slight suction, which means a slightly negative pressure. The normal pleural pressure at the beginning of an inspiration is about -5 H2O, which is the amount of suction required to hold the lungs open to their resting level. During normal inspiration, expansion of the chest cage pulls outward on the lungs with greater force and creates more negative pressure to an average about -7.5 cm H2O. This relationship between pleural pressure and changing lung volume are demonstrated. And alveolar pressure, the gas pressure inside the lung alveoli. When the glottis is open and no air is flowing into or out of the lungs, the pressure in all parts of the respiratory tree all the way to the alveoli are equal to atmospheric pressure, which is considered to be zero reference pressure in the airway, that is 0 cm H2O pressure. To cause inward flow of air into the alveoli during inspiration, the pressure in the alveoli must fall to a value slightly below atmospheric pressure. The second curve, labeled alveolar pressure, demonstrates that during normal inspiration, alveolar pressure decreases to about -1 cm H2O. The slight negative pressure is enough to pull 0.5 liter of air into the lungs in the 2 seconds required for normal quiet inspiration. Summary of the muscles acting during inspiration and expiration. Inspiration muscles, diaphragm, external intercostal muscles. Accessory inspiratory muscles, sternocleidomastoid muscles, anterior serrati muscles, scalani muscles, alainaceae muscles. Once again, sternocleidomastoid muscles, anterior serrati muscles, scalani muscles, alainaceae muscles, expiratory muscles, hyperventilation, rectus abdominis, internal intercostal muscle, internal and external obliques, transverse abdominis. The second curve, once again the inspiration, events in inspiration and expiration. In case of inspiration, respiratory centers initiate the stimuli for inspiration. These stimuli or impulses are carried via nerves to the respiratory muscles. The diaphragm and other inspiratory muscles contract. The chest wall expands, increasing the volume of thorax. Then the intrapleural pressure becomes more negative. The alveolar pressure decreases below the atmospheric pressure. The alveoli inflates as air flows into them until the alveolar pressure reaches atmospheric pressure. Events in inspiration and expiration. Once again, inspiration events. Respiratory centers initiate the stimulation for respiration or inspiration in particular. These stimulus are carried via nerves to the inspiratory muscles. The diaphragm and or other inspiratory muscles contract. The chest wall expands, increasing the volume of the thorax. The intrapleural pressure becomes more negative. The alveolar pressure decreases below the atmospheric pressure. The alveoli inflate as air flows into them until the alveolar pressure reaches atmospheric pressure. Once again, I'm going to read this. Respiratory, in case of inspiration, respiratory centers initiate the stimuli for inspiration. These impulses are carried via nerves to the inspiratory muscles. The diaphragm and or other inspiratory muscles contract, the chest wall expand, increasing the volume of the thorax, but the intrapleural pressure becomes more negative. The alveolar pressure decreases below the atmospheric pressure. The alveoli inflate as air flows into them until the alveolar pressure reaches atmospheric pressure. Then events of expiration, respiratory centers terminate the inspiratory muscles. Then the diaphragm and or other inspiratory muscles relax. The chest wall retreats and decreases the volume of the thorax. The intrapleural pressure becomes less negative. The alveolar pressure increases above the atmospheric pressure. The alveoli undergo elastic recoil, forcing the air out. The alveoli inflates as air flows out until the alveolar pressure reaches atmospheric pressure. Then transpulmonary pressure. That's nothing else but the difference between alveolar and pleural pressures. Transpulmonary pressure is the pressure difference between that in the alveoli and that on the outer surface of the lungs. Outer surface of the lungs, or pleural pressure. And it is a measure of the elastic forces in the lungs that tend to collapse the lungs at each instant of respiration, called a recoil pressure. And compliance of the lungs. The extent to which the lungs will expand for each unit increase in transpulmonary pressure, if enough time is allowed to reach equilibrium, is called the lung compliance. The extent to which lungs will expand. The total compliance of both lungs together in the normal adult human average is about 200 ml of air per centimeter of water. Transpulmonary pressure, that is, every time the transpulmonary pressure increases 1 centimeter in H2O, the lung volume after 10 to 20 seconds will expand 200 ml. That is compliance. Then compliance diagram of lungs. Relation is different for inspiration and expiration. Each curve is recorded by changing the pleural pressure in small steps and allowing the lung volume to come to a steady level between the successive steps. The two curves are called respectively the inspiratory compliance curve and the expiratory compliance curve, and the entire diagram is called the compliance diagram of the lungs. The characteristics of the compliance diagram are determined by the elastic forces of the lungs. These forces can be divided into two pairs, which are the elastic forces of the lung tissue. Elastic force is caused by surface tension of the fluid that lies inside the walls of the alveoli and other lung air spaces. The elastic forces of the lung tissue are determined mainly by elastin and collagen fibers interwoven among the lung parenchyma. In inflated lungs, these fibers are in an elastically contracted and kinked state. Then, when the lungs expand, the fibers become strengthened and unkinked, thereby elongating and exerting even more elastic force. The elastic force caused by surface tension are much more complex. The significance of surface tension is shown, which compare the compliance diagram of lungs when filled with a saline solution and then filled with air. When the lungs are filled with air, there is an interface between the alveolar fluid and the air in the alveoli. The lungs filled with saline solution, there is no air fluid interface. When filled with saline solution, there is no air fluid interface, and therefore the surface tension effect is not present. Only tissue elastic forces are operative in the lung. Only tissue elastic forces are operative in the lung filled with the saline solution. Note, the transpleural pressures required to expand air-filled lungs are about 3 times as high as those required to expand lungs filled with saline solution. Thus, one can conclude that the tissue elastic forces tending to cause collapse of the air-filled lung represent only about 1/3 of the total lung elasticity, whereas the fluid air surface tension forces in the alveoli represent about 2/3. The fluid air surface tension elastic forces of the lungs also increase tremendously, and the substance is called a surfactant not present in the alveolar fluid. Regional variation of compliance and effect of gravity. The basal region of the lungs are gravity dependent and receive more ventilation as compared to the upper region of the lungs. The basal regions of the lungs have less negative intrapleural pressure as compared to the upper regions of the lungs due to gravity and the weight of the lungs. This results in the upper region alveoli having larger volumes as compared to those in the basal and more dependent regions. The alveoli in the upper regions is already filled with air and are less compliant compared to those in the independent region. These are more compliant and are able to increase their volume in each breath. So surfactant, surface tension and collapse of alveoli. Principle of surface tension. When water forms a surface within air, the water molecules on the surface of the water have an especially strong attraction for one another. As a result, the water surface is always attempting to contract. This is what holds raindrops together, a tight contractile membrane of water molecule around the entire surface of the raindrop. Now let us reverse the principles and see what happens if the inner surface of the alveoli. Here the water surface is also attempting to contract. This tends to force air out of the alveoli through the bronchi and in doing so cause the alveoli to try to collapse. The net result is cause an elastic contractile force of the entire lungs, which is called the surface tension elastic force. Surface tension elastic force. Surfactant and its effect on surface tension. Surfactant is a surface active agent in water, which means that it greatly reduces the surface tension of water. It is secreted by special surfactant secreting epithelial cells called type 2 alveolar epithelial cells. Type 2 alveolar epithelial cells, which are the type 2 alveolar epithelial cells, which constitute about 10% of the surface area of the alveoli. The cells are granular, containing lipid inclusions that are secreted in the surfactant into the alveoli. They just secrete this. Surfactant is a complex mixture of several phospholipids, proteins, and ions. The most important component of the phospholipid dipalmitoyl phosphatidylcholine. Phospholipid dipalmitoyl phosphatidylcholine. Surfactant apoproteins. So we just learned about surfactant. What is a surfactant? Surfactant is a surface active agent in water, which means that it greatly reduces the surface tension of water. Don't forget the term surface active agent. Surface active agent in water, which means that it greatly reduces the surface tension of water. It is secreted by special surfactant secreting epithelial cells called type 2 alveolar epithelial cells, which constitute about 10% of the surface area of the alveoli. The cells are granular, containing lipid inclusions that are secreted in the surfactant into the alveoli. Surfactant is a complex nature of several phospholipids, proteins, and ions. The most important components are the phospholipid dipalmitoyl phosphatidylcholine, surfactant apoproteins, and calcium ions. The dipalmitoyl phosphatidylcholine and several less important phospholipids are responsible for reducing the surface tension. Thus, they perform this function by not dissolving and uniformly in the fluid lining the alveolar surface. Instead, part of the molecule dissolves while the remainder spreads over the surface of the water in the alveoli. The surface has from 1/12 to 1/2 of the surface tension of a pure water complex surface. Once again, the dipalmitoyl phosphatidylcholine and several less important phospholipids are responsible for reducing the surface tension. They perform this function by not dissolving uniformly in the fluid lining the alveolar surface. Instead, part of the molecule dissolves while the remainder spreads over the surface of the water in the alveoli. The surface has from 1/12 to 1/2 the surface tension of a pure water surface. In quantitative terms, the surface tension of different water fluids is approximately the following: pure water 72, like that. Then pressure in occluded alveoli caused by surface tension. If the air passage leading from the alveoli of the lungs are blocked, the surface tension in the alveoli tend to collapse the alveoli. This collapse creates positive pressure in the alveoli, attempting to push the air out. The amount of pressure generated in this way in an alveoli can be calculated using Laplace laws, which describe the relationship between the surface tension, radius of the alveoli, and the pressure from the following formula. Pressure is equal to 2 into surface tension by radius of alveoli. First, Summary of factors that determine lung compliance. Summary of factors that determine lung compliance. Elastic forces of the lung tissue. Elastic forces of the lung tissue. Elastin fibers woven in the lung parenchyma. Collagen fibers woven in the lung parenchyma. Elastic forces inside walls of the alveoli. Surface tension of the fluid that lines the inside walls of the alveoli. Surfactant helps. Elastic forces of the lung tissue. Elastin fibers woven in the lung parenchyma, collagen fibers woven in the lung parenchyma, elastic forces inside walls of the alveoli, surface tension of the fluid that lines the inside walls of the alveoli. Surfactant helps reduce the surface tension. And pressure in occluded alveoli caused by surface tension. If the air passage leading from the alveoli of the lungs are blocked, the surface tension in the alveoli tend to collapse the alveoli. So here we could see a pulmonary surfactant. Surfactant is a complex mixture of several phospholipids, proteins and ions. It contains dipalmitoyl phosphatidyl-choline. Dipalmitoyl phosphatidyl-choline. It is responsible for reducing the surface tension within the alveoli. It is produced by the type 2 alveolar epithelial cells. It is responsible for reducing the surface tension within the alveoli. It is produced by the type 2 alveolar epithelial cells. Pressure is equal to 2 into surface tension by radius of alveoli. For the average sized alveoli with a radius of about 100 μm and lined with a normal surfactant, this calculates to be around about 4 cm H2O pressure. If the alveoli were lined with pure water without any surfactant, the pressure would calculate to be around 18 cm H2O pressure, 4.5 times higher. Thus, one sees the importance of surfactant in reducing alveolar surface tension and therefore also reducing the effort required by the respiratory muscles to expand the lungs. The effect of alveolar radius on the pressure caused by surface tension. Note from the preceding formula that the pressure generated as a result of surface tension of the alveoli is inversely affected by the radius of the alveoli, which means that smaller the alveoli, greater the alveolar pressure caused by the surface tension. Smaller the alveolus, the greater is the alveolar pressure caused by the surface tension. Thus, when the alveoli have half the normal radius, the pressure noted earlier are doubled. The factors that stabilize the alveoli are listed. So, pathophysiology of respiratory distress syndrome. This is especially significant in small premature babies, many of whom have alveoli with radii less than 1/4 and that of the adult person. Further, surfactant does not normally begin to be secreted into the alveoli until between the 6th and 7th months of gestation. And in some cases even later. Therefore, many premature babies have little or no surfactant in the alveoli when they are born, and their lungs have an extreme tendency to collapse. Sometimes as high as 6 to 8 times that in normal adult person. The situation causes a condition called a respiratory distress syndrome of the newborn. If it is fatal if not treated with strong measures, especially properly applied continuous positive pressure breathing. What is that? Positive pressure breathing should be applied. So factors that stabilize the alveoli: pulmonary surfactant reduces surface tension within alveoli. Mechanical interdependence prevents alveolar collapse. Effect of the thoracic cage on lung expandability. Thus far, we have discussed the expansibility of the lung alone without considering the thoracic cage. The thoracic cage has its own elastic and viscous characteristics similar to those of the lungs. Even if the lungs were not present in the thorax, muscular effort would still be required to expand the thoracic cage. Compliance of the thoracic and the lungs together. The compliance of the interpulmonary system. The lungs and thoracic cage together is measured while expanding the lungs to a totally relaxed or paralyzed subject. To measure compliance, air is forced into the lungs a little at a time while recording lung pressure and volumes. To inflate this total pulmonary system, at most type as much pressure is required to inflate the same lungs after removal from the chest cage is necessary. Therefore, the compliance of the combined lung-thorax system is almost exactly one half that of the lungs alone. 110 ml of volume per centimeter of water pressure for the combined system compared with 200 ml per centimeter of the lungs alone. Furthermore, when the lungs are expanded to high volumes or compared to low volumes, The limitations of the chest become extreme. When near these limits, the compliance of the combined lung-thoracic system can be less than one-fifth that of the lungs alone. Conditions of increased or decreased compliance is very important. Then work of breathing. Work of breathing. We have already pointed out that during normal, quiet breathing, all respiratory muscles contraction occurs during inspiration. Expiration is almost entirely a passive process. Expiration is a passive process caused by the elastic recoil of lungs and chest cage. Elastic recoil of the lungs and the chest cage. Thus, under resting conditions, the respiratory muscles normally perform work to cause inspiration but not to cause expiration. The work of inspiration can be divided into three fractions that required to expand the lungs against the lung and chest. Elastic forces called compliance work of elastic work. That required to expand the lungs against the lung and chest. Elastic forces called compliance work or elastic work. That required to overcome the viscosity of the lung and chest wall structure called tissue resistance work. And that required to overcome airway resistance to movement of air into lungs called airway resistance work. Compliance work, tissue resistance work, airway resistance work. Energy required for respiration. During normal, quiet respiration only 3 to 5% of the total energy expanded by the body is required for pulmonary ventilation. However, during heavy exercise, the amount of energy required can increase as much as 50-fold, especially if the person has any degree of increased airway resistance or decreased pulmonary complaints. Therefore, one of the major limitations in the intensity of exercise that can be performed in the person's ability to provide enough muscle energy for the respiratory process alone. Then minute respiratory volume. The minute respiratory volume is the total amount of new air moved into the respiratory passage each minute that is equal to the tidal volume times the respiratory rate per minute. The normal tidal volume is about 500 ml and the normal respiratory rate is about 12 breaths per minute. Therefore, the minute respiratory volume averages about 6 liters per minute. Then alveolar ventilation. The rate at which new air reaches alveoli, alveolar sacs, alveolar ducts, and respiratory bronchioles is called alveolar ventilation. The ultimate importance of pulmonary ventilation is to continuously renew the air in the gas exchange areas of lungs where air is in proximity to the pulmonary blood. Next topic, dead space. Some of the air in a person breathes never reaches the gas exchange areas but simply fills a respiratory passage where gas exchange does not occur, such as nose, pharynx, and trachea. These are called dead space air because it is not useful for gas exchange. And on expiration, the air in the dead space is expired first before any of the air from the alveoli reaches the atmosphere. Therefore, the dead space is very disadvantageous for removing the expiratory gases of the lungs. The measurement of the dead space volume. A simple method for measuring dead space volume is demonstrated by graph. Making this measurement, a substance suddenly takes a deep breath of 100% O2, which fills the entire dead space with the pure O2. Some oxygen also mixes with the alveolar air but does not completely replace this air. When the person expires through a rapidly recording nitrogen meter, which makes the record. So the first portion of the expired air comes from the dead space regions of the respiratory passageways where the air that is completely replaced by O2. Therefore, the early part of the record only O2 appears and the nitrogen concentration is 0. Then when alveolar air begins to reach the nitrogen meter, the nitrogen concentration rises rapidly because alveolar air containing a large amount of nitrogen begins to mix with the dead space air. After still more air has been expired, all the dead space air are washed from the passage and only alveolar air remains. Therefore, the record nitrogen concentration reaches a plateau level equal to its concentration of the alveoli. With a little thought, the student can see that a grey area representing the area contained. There is a grey area which is equal to PD. Normal dead space volume. The normal dead space air in a young adult man is about 150 ml. Dead space air increases slightly with age. Anatomical versus physiological dead space. Anatomical dead space is the method just described for measuring the dead space. Measures the volume of all the space of the respiratory system other than the alveoli and their other closely related gas exchange areas. This space is called anatomical dead space. Physiological dead space. On occasion, some of the alveoli themselves are non-functional or only partially functional because of absent or poor blood flow through the adjacent pulmonary capillaries. Therefore, anatomical dead space, the method just described for measuring the dead space, measures the volume of all the space of the respiratory system other than the alveoli and their other closely related gas exchange areas. The space is called anatomical dead space. And physiological dead space. Next, physiological dead space. On occasion, some of the alveoli themselves are non-functional or may only partially functional because of absence or poor blood flow through the adjacent pulmonary capillaries. Therefore, from a functional point of view, this alveoli must also be considered dead space. When the alveolar dead space is included in the total measurement of dead space, this is called a physiological dead space. In contradiction to the anatomical dead space, in a normal person, anatomical and physiological dead space are nearly equal because all alveoli are functional. Why? Because all alveoli are functional in normal lung. But in a person with a particularly functional or non-functional alveoli in some parts of the partially functional or non-functional alveoli in some parts of the lungs, the physiological dead space must be much as 10 times the volume of the anatomical dead space. These problems are very important. So, in those persons, physiological